Dean Rebecca Sipus to introduce our program for tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening. I met on the trip that she's going to talk about in January 2023, and she has since become a very dear colleague and friend. Dr. Jill Citron Katz has been teaching archaeology, anthropology, and Jewish history at Yeshiva University since 2003. She also serves as chair of the Sociology Department and academic advisor. So I don't know how many hats that was. It's a lot of hats. There are certain faculty members in any university who are what I would call a load-bearing faculty members. Without them, the place doesn't really run, and Jill is certainly one of those. As a researcher, she specializes in biblical archaeology, and she has excavated various sites in Israel, including Ashkelon, Gerar, Gath, and Jerusalem. Her research focuses on biblical peoples, Canaanites, Israelites, and Philistines, and their interactions. She's the author of the book, The Archaeology of Cult in Middle Bronze Age Canaan, which explores what Canaanite religion was like at the time of the biblical patriarchs, using the archaeological record from the biblical city of Gerar as a test case. You see, I did a little research there. Jill, it's really wonderful to have you here in Raritan Valley. Thank you so much for coming, and please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Jill Katz.
Hey, good evening, everybody. And the recording is on. Everything's good. Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for coming out on a Saturday night. I'm very impressed by the Raritan Valley, by the spirit here. Also, of course, just quickly to thank Dean Sipus, who I think was the shotgun for this, and also Josh Kaplan and Mark Abraham for the work that you did in bringing me to this evening. Okay, so I'm an archaeologist, and so I'm going to speak to you about, you'll see the title is An Archaeologist Reevaluates Destruction in Light of October 7th. And what that does mean is I will actually touch on events that happened on October 7th, particularly at towards the end of the presentation, and I'll show some images that might be, pretty sensitive. So just wanted to give you a heads up. I'll let you know before we're getting to that, just so that you're forewarned. Yes, to go back a year plus, there was a group of Jewish scholars from actually, I think the original group, it was obviously after October 7th, so many of us, in the Jewish community across the globe, I mean, we just felt so helpless, right? I mean, we felt, we just didn't know what to do. So, and we wanted to do something. We wanted to support the people in Israel. We wanted to come together. We felt, just grasping at anything that we could do. So a group of colleagues from Yeshiva University, from Jewish Theological Seminary and HUC, a core group was formed, and they decided that they were going to have a solidarity trip. It was one that was going to show like Jewish unity in America, and that they were going to go to Israel and to meet with particularly academic colleagues in Israel. And then it broadened out, and it included Jewish studies scholars kind of across the country. And that's how Dean Sipus at the time was from Rutgers, and she joined the group. And originally it was going to be 3 from Yeshiva University, 3 from JTS, and 3 from HUC. And I was not part of that planning group. And then HUC said, well, we're going to bring a 4th person. And so Yeshiva University said, well, if you're going to bring a 4th person, we're going to bring a 4th person. And that's how I got the call. So I was very happy, the 4th person to go. I didn't have to do any of the planning. And I got to go on this trip where I got to spend time with wonderful colleagues. And you know how these things are, where you want to go, you want to help, you want to somehow, bring strength to Israel because it's of what it's gone through. And of course, we did all those things, but I think at the end, it was one of those where we realized we also probably got so much out of the trip, maybe more than we actually contributed. And so this talk is going to be based primarily on two of the activities that we did on that trip. One of which was to go to visit Kibbutz Kfar Aza, where we saw, this was January, so the destruction was still, pretty much untouched. And I mean, to the point where you still saw the sukkah was still there. And then a couple days later, we actually met with the archaeologists, a couple of archaeologists at the Israel Antiquities Authority in their new home, which is actually a beautiful home right near the new National Library, which we also visited. And I also, little plug, if next time you're in Jerusalem, I definitely recommend you go to the new National Library. But we went to the Israel Antiquities Authority and met with a couple of the archaeologists there who told us about their experience, because post October 7th, where, there was a lot of, there was uncertainty over, if you remember those days of, who had been taken hostage, who hadn't, who, there was some people they just didn't know for sure whether they had been taken hostage or if they were missing or whatever. And so archaeologists actually brought the tools of their trade to try to help, and basically treated the Nova Festival, the cars, and the various settlements. Basically, a massive archaeological program was done using the methodology, but to try to identify, to see if we could see if there were any victims. And I'll get to it a little bit later on, but they were able to identify people, which on the one hand is obviously just awful. On the other hand, it gave some certainty, so people kind of knew what had happened to their loved ones. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to talk about. It's not necessarily an easy topic. I'll try to be light, because I'll talk about kind of how archaeologists approach things. But later on it will get a little bit serious. Okay, I'm going to try to change okay, this is now we're testing my competency here. Arrow down, you think? Nope, that's not working. Click on the slide. Okay. Oh, that's why you're the boss. Okay. All right. So, and everybody, great. Everybody can see. So this is also a little bit awkward to say in front of my boss, but basically you'll see archaeology. You don't really have to be that smart to do archaeology. The principles are really, really simple, right? If I were to try to explain to you, like if I were a physicist here and I'm trying to explain to you what I do, I would, I'm not sure you would understand by the end. But archaeology, you're all going to get this really simply. But basically, there's a few fundamental principles of archaeology, and in some ways they share some of them with geology. So you may know this if you ever took Rocks for Jocks or something like that. But anyway, the first thing to know about archaeology is this concept of stratigraphy. Okay, so stratigraphy comes from the word stratum, which is singular, strata, which is plural, which is the layers, like different layers. And the idea is that you have different occupational layers, kind of one on top of the other. And here you can see it nicely in these rocks where you have kind of the vibrant, red running through. But basically, the other thing is, if you're colorblind, archaeology is really not a good field for you, because you do need to we really do, it's called reading the stratigraphy. And we once had a student from Yeshiva University, actually, and we told him, like, okay, dig out this part until you see the change of color. Came back like 30 minutes later, he totally blasted through. And we're like, wait a minute, didn't you see the change of color? He says, oh, I'm colorblind. We're like, oh, okay, you're just going to wash pottery. We can't can't have you like excavating anything. But archaeologists do spend a lot of time looking very carefully and looking for any kind of change in color and texture and matrix, because that can indicate a different level, different occupational level, different, we sort of read the stratigraphy, right? That's sort of what you try to do. So that's number one. And here's a nice little picture that I like, that sort of shows how you can have one layer on top of another. And you see there's a whole story that's actually being told here, that, we try to interpret. And so in general, you'll see, one layer, 2 layers, 3 layers, 4 layers, but then there's a lot of other things going on too. And archaeologists are trained to kind of recognize, sometimes you have an intrusive pit, or you have a foundation, that is sunk into an earlier layer in order to support a later wall. You can tell the differences between, a floor level, that's where the pottery is going to lie nice and flat. You have floor makeup, which is going to be kind of thick and dense. And then, of course, one of the things we excavate would be like a destruction layer. And that, I'm going to talk about how we love destruction, but basically destruction layers also are very easy to dig because they tend not to be as firm and as compact as other layers. So that's basically, and you see on the top, of course, is the modern topsoil. And in the topsoil, sometimes you can get a real mishmash of things because there's little animals that are burrowing and they're bringing up stuff from way down there. Sometimes the animals are going really far down and bringing things up. But also on the topsoil, you can get scorpions. And one year, we really had a lot of scorpions. So I told the students every 25, I would buy them ice cream. So I actually had to buy ice cream, I think 3 times that season. Well worth it though, because then they were very attentive to the scorpions and no one got injured. So just, I'm going to have to add that to the waiver, I think. All right. Okay, then the other principle, which you probably already know, is this idea of superpositioning, which is basically the general idea is that the more recent levels will be closer to the surface, to the top, and as you dig down, you're going to get into older and older layers. Okay, this is basically now, this is archaeology. And the other thing for any of you who do want to go on a dig is it's very important that you dig kind of level. We don't want you to dig pits or anything like that. So I always tell the students, imagine the way a swimming pool drains water. That's basically how you should excavate. So you try to bring it down a little bit. So you might start with 2 to 5 centimeters at a time and just bring it down slowly. Because you want to be able to notice everything. And it also depends kind of what you're looking for, right? So 100 years ago, people were excavating, they were really looking for the goodies. So they would just kind of remove the dirt as quickly as possible and look for the large vessels or the architecture, like that type of thing. But nowadays we actually work much, much more slowly, because things that we're interested in also include seeds, bones. In the olden days, they just threw all these things out. We even analyze the soil, which is, yes, another way of saying dirt, and trying to see if we can even identify if something was burned and at what temperature, if it was a high temperature or a low temperature. So we tend to work pretty slowly. All right. Now, the final concept to introduce for you is this idea of association. Or another way of saying context. But the basic idea here is that if you have a layer and it's an identifiable layer, then the idea is that everything that's found in that layer is from the same time period. So if you look at the picture here, you see stratum A at the top, then B, then C, then there's a D, and then there's an E. So everything found in E, we're going to basically assume is from the same time period. Everything that was found in B, right, is going to be from the same time period. And then you can also use this to apply across, to different sites, because if you have stratum B, right, you see here with a glass bottle and a horseshoe and a steel awl, and you find these exact items at another site that maybe in that case it's stratum 8 or whatever, you can then say, oh, those are from the same time period. Then hopefully at some point, like the gentleman who showed me the things earlier, at some point you might have a coin that helps you to identify the actual time period. Stratigraphy is just relative. It only tells you older, older, younger, older, more recent. That's considered a type what we call relative dating. And if you want absolute dating, then you need something like a coin or carbon-14 dating, which you can do on anything that was once alive, or any kind of, let's see, what else? Dendrochronology is also, tree ring dating is also another way to get an absolute date. Okay, so these are the basic principles of archaeology that we use when we excavate. Again, not exactly rocket science here. All right. And then as far as, if you talk to archaeologists anywhere across the world, they're going to tell you and kind of in a, this is fun. But basically archaeologists love destruction. Okay. Because destruction, what it does is you'll get kind of a single event as opposed to like time, very slowly eroding or something, but you get this kind of single event where there tends to be a lot of things that are preserved. The number one find on any archaeological site is our ceramics, broken pots or complete pots. Is there any chance in Israel of getting whole vessels? There's tombs. That's one option. We don't have a lot of tombs in Israel, but there are some. And then in these destruction layers where basically people are forced to flee their homes, they just sort of abandon everything that's there, and things collapse and they get very well preserved. So when you work a destruction layer at a site, especially if the site, if the site has been completely destroyed, you're going to find it everywhere. And it's kind of like no matter where you're working on the site, at some point you're going to be like, oh, this is the 9th century destruction layer. Oh, I recognize this. And it's the same feel. It's the kind of the soft soil. You see the chunky chalks and all of a sudden like the whole vessels just start popping up. So it can be kind of exciting if you're an archaeologist to work in destruction. Now, just keep in mind, as an archaeologist, usually I'm working in things that are very old, very far removed from them. I don't really know the people, so it's a very, kind of a different experience in that sense. But archaeologists across the globe, like any kind of destruction event, is going to be one that yields a lot of material remains and the structural remains as well. And as I say, we even have our favorite ones. So one of the prime examples and a great site to go to in Israel, which is not really one of the big national parks, and that has to do for historical reasons, but is Lachish. So Lachish is actually it was the second most important city in Judah behind Jerusalem. So a very important administrative city. And you can see it here on this map. And Lachish is one of those sites that actually has not one, but two amazing destruction layers. The first one is the in between. It's actually level 3. It's just kind of everyone Lachish level 3, and everybody knows what it is. That is the destruction from the time of Sancherib. Okay, so the Assyrian conquest. When the Assyrians, right, the same Assyrians who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, they then swoop down later on and move into Judah, and this is the time of Chizkiyahu. And while Jerusalem is actually saved and not conquered at the time, Lachish is actually destroyed. So that's Lachish 3. Subsequently, afterwards, the city is rebuilt, and then the next invaders who come in, the Babylonians come, and Lachish 2 is destroyed by the Babylonians. So you have these two very, very clear destruction layers. that give us excellent dating. And so all the material culture associated with those layers, we know pretty much precisely what era that it comes from. And there's really spectacular finds that have come in those destruction layers, like Lachish 2. That's where you have the famous Lachish letters, very, very poignant letters that mention, on the one hand, they mention that there is this Navi who is discouraging the people. Of course, that is most likely a reference to Yirmiyahu. And then there's also even, on a more poignant level, letters that are sent saying that they're watching the smoke signals between, I think, Tel Azekah and where they are, and Azekah, which is another settlement. The signals have stopped, and basically meaning that city, they have just overrun, the Babylonians have just overrun that city, and like they're coming towards us. So we have, this site is across the board, its destruction is really well known, really well studied. The level 3, for example, this is a picture showing you Lachish, and the level 3 city right before its destruction, that was destroyed by the Assyrians. We know so much about this destruction. We have the biblical account, both in like Malachim and also in Yeshayahu. We also have the archaeological site. We have the Assyrian account, right? Sancherib writes about it. And we even have the Lachish reliefs that Sancherib then put in his palace at Nineveh, basically decorating the walls of his throne room. And now you can see them at the British Museum. So we really, it's so well illuminated, this particular event. This is the prism of Sancherib, where he mentions he talks about all of the cities that he's destroyed, and of course the famous mention where he says about Chizkiyahu, who basically started the revolt against him, that he didn't quite get rid of him, but he left him like a caged bird in Jerusalem. So we have that mentioned here in this 6-sided prism that you see. This is a section of the reliefs that are found you can see them, as I said, at the British Museum. What you're seeing here is actually a siege ramp that the Assyrians had built. They built like this ramp basically to get their siege engine up to the wall so that they could pound the wall, and you have that very clearly shown here. Here's the drawing made by Layard's team that makes it a little bit easier to see. And you can see even where you see the camel, that's where they're already taking the loot away. But you have, and you can see the amount of weapons. I mean, it gives you a sense, like it's a very visceral scene that I've seen before. And again, this is Lachish, right? This was part of Judah, right? This is our people. And yet, because it's so long ago, when I see it, it's Lachish, it's great. But this is a Judahite city being attacked. I mean, the people must have been terrified, absolutely. And then their whole town was destroyed, and many of them were killed, and the rest were deported. So I mean, traumatic, absolutely traumatic event that you see here, and it gets kind of grisly even more so. This area, I'm just right up there. Sorry about that. I'm going to show you a close. I'm going to come back to it. Okay, so that area in the red is what I've circled. That was on that relief there, and that actually is. Those are Jews who've been impaled. Okay, they're being impaled on stakes, which was a way of doing business back in the day. And in fact, with Purim coming up, I mean, there is a suggestion, and a pretty good suggestion, that Haman's sons, that ultimately, I mean, what he wanted to put Mordechai on was like one of these stakes, and that to be when they were to be hung up, it didn't mean like hanged the way we imagine with like a noose around your neck, but to be impaled on these stakes. These are Jews being impaled on the stakes and being glorified, right? I mean, this is in the king's throne room. He has a picture of naked Jews on stakes. So yeah, incredibly vicious and yet glorified. Going back one, this actually archaeologically, we see the siege ramp that the Assyrians made. They had tons of rubble was dumped. They actually had logs as rollers embedded in it, because they kind of the same way like when you go through TSA, they have the rollers, right, to get your suitcase. So they used logs also to kind of roll up these battering rams that they were going to use. But archaeologically, like this destruction is so complete on so many levels, so well documented, considering that it's 2,700 years ago. And you can see all this if you go to Lachish. It's not a great archaeological park, and I don't even know if they probably don't, I don't even know if they like sell bottled water there anymore. They used to not. I think they're trying to make it more accessible. But it is an incredibly important site. Okay. And then, so that's one, like Lachish is kind of the paradigm for destruction in the land of Israel, as far as being able to kind of put it all together. Now this pasuk, which is from Melachim Bet, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's actually, next week is Parshat Shkalim, right? Actually, my husband confirmed that for me. And I think the Haftarah is also from Melachim Bet. And I think this is the line, like the pasuk right after where that Haftarah ends. But basically, this now is talking about Hazael, the king of Aram, who was kind of a big regional player. He came up and attacked Gath, it says, and captured it. And then he marched on to Jerusalem. Again, another person who he gets to Jerusalem, he doesn't conquer it. They had to bribe him and give him stuff out of the Beit HaMikdash, some gold and silver and things like that. But it's kind of a throwaway line here in Tanakh as far as Gath goes, but it talks about how he came up and attacked Gath and captured it. Now, Gath is Tel Tzafi. It's a well-known archaeological site, and it's actually a site that I worked on for 20 years. So, and we have this destruction that's mentioned here in this pasuk, again, just a few words. We have spent countless hours excavating this destruction, and it's been incredibly informative of what we've learned. I mean, it's been incredible. So here you can see where Gath is. It's the name of the Philistine city is Gath, and I guess the Arabic name was Tel Asafi. The Hebrew name is Tel Tzafit. It's all the same place. And it's pretty close to Ekron. You can see it's just south. It's about 9 kilometers south of Ekron. Is one of the 5 main Philistine cities of their Pentapolis. And the biggest one, and the one kind of the closest to Yehuda at the time. And interestingly about this site, where not only do we have the evidence of destruction at the site, but we actually have the evidence of this is the Arameans who are doing this, so Aram. We have evidence of the siege trench that they built around the site, because, in these days, the attacks, the destruction, I mean, these aren't surprise attacks, something like this. When you're going to besiege a city, you come with an army, and then you surround the city. Now you can surround it just with men, right, with soldiers, but in this case, they actually built basically a huge trench around the city, which must have, taken hours to make. And again, if you think about it from the perspective of the people in the city, I mean, again, absolutely terrifying, right? You have this Aramean army outside encircling your city. What does it mean? Of course, nobody gets in, nobody gets out. It's all part of the psychological warfare, and then of course the physical warfare too, which is that they're also then once they've encircled you, then they're going to start to I mean, early on, mostly it was a waiting game. It was more the Assyrians were the ones who introduced the concept that you bash down the wall. So probably for the Arameans, it was more of a waiting game. You just stood out there, and for 3 years, you just waited for the city to slowly starve to death. And that was kind of the way that you did it. So, so we have this, and this is just showing you a close-up of that trench, which we excavated in some parts, and then from aerial shots, you could kind of see the evidence of it all around the city. And here's an artist's reconstruction. And by the way, as an archaeologist, this was super exciting to find, right? Wow, we found the siege trench. Again, not necessarily focusing on, again, on what that meant for the people in the town, but for us, it was very exciting because there's some texts that mention these siege trenches, and no one had ever found one before. So this was, great research. And here you see a group of some Yeshiva University and Bar Ilan students who were actually working not in the siege trench, but just on the hill opposite where the city wall would have been and where the people would have been basically lining up, looking out over and seeing the siege trench being built. And so you get a sense like they wouldn't have sat idly by. One thing we know at Lachish, for example, I forgot to mention, is that they actually built their own counter ramp inside the city to try to fortify the place where the Assyrians were trying to bash down the wall. All right, so that's okay. So again, we have our favorite destruction layers. Destruction is everywhere. That's the other thing, right? I mean, that's the nature of life, particularly in the Middle East, is there's destruction everywhere. And then here's an article that I had the privilege to be part of because it was with a team from the Weizmann Institute. So it was very scientific. I was the field archaeologist. Like I just did the digging and then they took it from there. But basically this was another thing that archaeologists want to understand is also how things, what happens in destruction. Like we have the archaeological remains, but how did they get that way? Like so for example, if a building is destroyed, what does that mean? What gets destroyed? What happens first? Based on what we find, do the walls collapse first and the roof comes down on top? Does the roof come first? How quickly does that happen? So through this study, we were able to determine at our site at Tel Tzafi, as part of this destruction layer against that Aram came, was that the single shock event would have basically been that the houses were set on fire and the roofs would have collapsed pretty much right away. And then the place becomes uninhabitable. And then the walls, though, which are made out of mud brick, they slowly decay. And it could take as much as, 40, 60 years for them to be completely, to have completely gone back basically to dirt. That's kind of what we discovered here. And the other thing is because these houses so frequently, they're made out of mud brick, sun-dried mud brick, and the roofs were a lot of thatch, that type of thing, but they used their roofs to store things. And one of the things they stored on their roofs was olive oil. So of course, if that caught on fire, the olive oil became a source of fuel and would burn at a much higher temperature than it would be if you didn't have the olive oil. And that would kind of also, hasten the destructive process, basically all this olive oil catching on fire. And everybody would have had a ton of oil. I mean, that was the basic, every household stored oil, that you harvested the olives in the fall and the oil was made pretty much right afterwards. And then you kept it throughout the year so that you could have light, basically, So it was a really important commodity and widely used, rich, poor, everybody was using oil. So again, you had this kind of fuel source that would sort of spark. All right, we can skip that. And then another thing that caused a lot of sort of excitement, I should say, in the archaeological community was, this is from Ir David, the city of David. And they found obviously lots of destruction in the city of David. And you see that very dark, right? That's ash. So that's a remnant of like real burning. And this is kind of an interesting discovery that a young Hebrew University scholar kind of realized, and it had to do with the issue of paleomagnetism. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain this as best I can. But if you don't understand by the time I'm done, it's basically because I didn't explain it very well. So everybody knows the Earth has a magnetic pole, right? North, south. So that magnetic pole actually slightly moves, not enough that it makes a difference for us in our day-to-day lives, but it does have slight variation. So it's not actually constant. And when when clay burns, because there is some magnetic material in the clay, like little tiny bits of iron or nickel or something, basically if it gets to a really high temperature, all of the iron, like in a magnet, it'll all line up towards magnetic north at that particular moment of the heating process. And then as it cools, it gets kind of frozen into that alignment. And so this basically, by going to places in Jerusalem that were already identified with the Babylonian destruction in 586, and measuring the orientation of the little bits of iron of magnetism in the bricks there, he was basically able to determine what the true north was, what exactly the orientation of the magnetic field on that particular day, the 9th of Av in 586 BCE. Okay, which is kind of cool on an intellectual level. You got to admit that's pretty spectacular. Now, whether that's true or not, like I'm just believing him. I'm just okay. You figured that out. Then once he has that, it's like a fingerprint, because then he can go to other places in Jerusalem or even elsewhere, but let's say in Jerusalem, and say he's not sure whether this was from the Babylonian destruction or maybe it's from another destruction or whatever. And he can then measure the orientation of all the magnetic pieces, and he can say, oh my goodness, that's exactly the same as what I have here. That too is from the 9th of Av. So anyways, these are just all little things that make archaeologists very excited about destruction. Okay. And then they wrote it up in this article. Yes, his name is Shar Vaknin. He's like, some Russian Elui who like figured this all out. Okay, now we're gonna get towards October 7th. So let me just see, what's my next? Okay, so now I'm going to show you some pictures from some of what we saw when we went to Kfar Aza. So just to kind of forewarn you. Okay. And yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to show you the pictures. I'm sure you've seen many of you have seen these before. But basically, when we toured Kfar Aza, you just saw, just widespread destruction all over. I mean, some of the houses were somewhat standing, partially standing, some more destroyed than others. You see the charred remains of, you see burning, evidence of burning everywhere, and you see the evidence of collapse. And this is January, so this is less than 3 months after this is two to 3 months after the event. And here, just again, the widespread destruction. And this is just one of the little kibbutzim where we saw that. And trying to make sense of it, right? I mean, like none of us could put it in, to put it into words was virtually impossible, right? I mean, I think for me, like the only thing that resonated was like Echa, right? I mean, just kind of like, you know, whoa, how did this happen? And this incredible transformation of what had once just a few months been like this incredibly vibrant community full of life, and you saw children's toys everywhere, and like I said, the sukkah was still standing. That actually seems to not have been touched. And you just, again, like, you know, having words to express these emotions it's like almost like there's no words. We didn't know what to say. And you know, you can feel, but language becomes a very poor medium of trying to express what you are saying. And then now the role of the archaeologist. So basically, the archaeologists, as I said, were called, they volunteered. These are the Israel Antiquities Authority, obviously, has about 400 archaeologists actually on staff. And then there's also archaeologists who work at universities, but more of them work at the Israel Antiquities Authority. And for the most part, they love what they do, right? I mean, they're certainly not in it for the money, right? I mean, they love, you know, that's what they do. When they wake up in the morning, many of them, their job is to go to, they're expanding a new road. And so they've hit some remains, and so they excavate them, or they're building a new building, and they're called in. It's mostly, what the Israel Antiquities Authority does mostly is salvage work. It's very quick. They don't, it's not like a long-term research project. It's more just, we need to expand the road, or we need to build this building, but we hit remains, so please do it very quickly, because we want to make sure that people call us when this happens. But if you take too long, then people are going to try to fool us and not tell us. Okay, so they get called all the time, all over Israel, doing stuff, and it's always working. In just fun fact, in Israel, and something is not considered sort of archaeologically worthy. It's not considered an antiquity unless it's pre-Ottoman. Okay, so which is funny, because in America, right, if you have something that's like 200 years old, we're like, wow, that's really old. There, it has to be at least 500 years old in order for it to have kind of the status where it merits excavation. So, anyway, so the archaeologists came in and basically used our methodology, right? Archaeology fundamentally is a methodology. It's, I told you, the stratigraphy and the way that we excavate very slowly. You probably, you know, if you've ever seen Indiana Jones, you know that we also do sifting to try to find like every little tiny thing. So if you want to look for beads, or you want to look for seeds, you have to, you know, work very carefully and very slowly. So they were brought in, again, as I mentioned, because there was this issue of people who were missing, and it wasn't clear whether they'd been taken hostage or whether they were dead, or, you know, and to see if there was any way that they could help identify the bodies. Now, there really were, there weren't bodies. Okay, again, the temperatures of these burnings was so high that sometimes it was only 1 to 2 centimeters of a person was left. Maybe it was a tooth. Teeth are actually will preserve the best. The enamel is very hard. But it also just kind of depends on the circumstances. Here you'll see an image. This is actually my dear friend Joe Uziel, who is now is the head of the Israel Antiquities Authority, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But he's been a field archaeologist, you know, prior to accepting that job. And they went to the different places, and also including the Nova Festival, and also like a lot of these cars were so burned out, but they didn't know if people had been burned in the cars or not. And so they basically just very, very carefully went through the levels of ash, again, 1 centimeter at a time, 1 centimeter at a time, very, very slowly digging. Here you can see that they're sifting and trying to just, apply their methodology to assist in this process of identifying the missing. And here, just again to show you, you can see, I mean, they're working in, but you see the burning, you see it's ash. And they're just in, I mean, this is a destruction layer, but it's a destruction layer from so immediate. They said the smell was just overwhelming. And I mean, they're just like this, like archaeology, we're used to working on things where people like, yes, the people died, but it was 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. It is, I don't know if I'm supposed to feel different, but you do. It's natural. You don't feel the immediacy that you did here. And knowing that how, that this methodology was kind of the only way that you were going to be able to get some answers, and how, it's not often that, somebody says, is there an archaeologist in the house? Like people generally don't call us. We're not that important, but here we did come through. And you can see here, I have one more picture just showing you them really sifting through, looking for anything. Sometimes it was jewelry. Sometimes it was fragments of bone. Just anything that they could find. And I think that they were able to identify over somewhere between 20 and 30 individuals, actually, which, again, not something that they wanted to find, but they did. And so I'm going to sort of kind of end here. I realize this is a hard image to end with, but I think, and again, this was from like about a year ago. Most of this work is done now. They've kind of done what they're going to do, the archaeologists. Some of them, a lot of them are really suffering still from a little bit of PTSD from the work that they did. The other thing is, so I'm gonna, let's see, I'll try to, I'm gonna actually stop the share. Sorry about this, just gonna, we'll just kind of leave it like, I'll just go like that. And so that work is basically done. But I feel like, especially what we went through last week, that those emotions are very raw for us again. And I mean, and these things come and they go. But I just wanted to share with you that, my takeaway from all of this has been for me to just sort of really reconsider, archaeology is fun, right? I mean, that's why you do it. And yet, and we work in destruction. That's the bread and butter. But now I definitely have taken kind of a little bit more of a serious, not that I wasn't serious, but again, more awareness that because of what I saw and what destruction, the impact, I mean, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. So to be cavalier about it, I actually spoke to Joe about this, and I said to him, I said, I feel like I'm humiliated that I actually kind of had this cavalier attitude towards destruction. And even though it was from a long time ago, now I really appreciate. And so, it just helps me reframe, as an archaeologist, as a historian. Sometimes it's hard to really connect to events in the past. And unfortunately, when you have something like this, it does allow you a glimpse of where you can connect again with the past. And so definitely, Tisha B'Av has taken on more resonance for me in that way. But anyway, so that's what I do. I'm an archaeologist, and I don't know if I love destruction anymore, but I do like to excavate, and so I will continue to do that. And it's not all destruction, but it is a lot of it. So, all right, I guess I'm going to stop here, and I'll take some questions if anybody.
So I'm happy to moderate if I have questions. Andrew.
Do you ever find human remains in ancient sites? Feet, bones, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely do.
Identify, are they Jews, or are they Philistines, or are they Aramaic, like all that?
Yeah, so we,
Can you repeat the question?
oh, okay. So I'm going to repeat the question. The question is, do we find human remains in archaeological sites? And the answer is absolutely. The very first excavation I worked on when I was an undergrad, I was at, I worked at Ashkelon actually, and we did find human remains, but they were very careful. I mean, it's a very, sensitive thing, right? So we don't dig cemeteries, right? I mean, we weren't deliberately trying to find human remains. But sometimes you do come across them. And at Ashkelon, this was in the 80s, they basically at the site, they would use a code word if they ever found human remains. I mean, it happened, that particular site, it was bananas. So it's like, oh, I found some bananas or something like that. Because there was this, they were worried that there were people in Israel who would be very upset that you were excavating bones, and they would try to, even though it was a Philistine site, they would try to shut down the excavation, and no one wanted the excavation shut down. We don't really do that whole code word thing isn't really a thing anymore. But like, you're working in destruction. So the site the area where we were doing the house and trying to reconstruct how it destroyed, we did find a juvenile who clearly had been crushed by the walls. And so it was an intact body. And other time, and I will tell you, the bodies are treated extremely respectfully. The bones were collected, they were actually sent to the university, they were analyzed, and then they're reburied. So we do that when we find bones, but they are actually studied. And that particular site is Philistine, so I guess, it's not a Jewish kid, most likely. So, but yeah, we do find bones.
Seems to me one of the most important things is, having proof of that the good connection to land. And the question is, do you work with archaeologists, from other countries and other religions, whatever, and collaborate on kind of proving what was where, when, and things like that? In other words, are there, let's say, Arab countries that have archaeologists that kind of concur with what's your findings?
Okay, so the question was about collaboration with others, non-Jews, non-Israelis, maybe even Arabs. So, what's really interesting, I mean, Israel is probably one of the most open for business archaeological sites, places, that in Greece are probably the most popular places for people to come and excavate. And people come from all over. The dig that I was on for many, many years, we would be about 100 to 120 people, and it was a consortium, including Colorado Christian University. We had one of the field directors was from Brigham Young University, Grand Valley State, which is just a public university. We had University of Melbourne. So these are large international teams. I will tell you, the students from Yeshiva University really, really connected well with the evangelical students. And well, no marriages. No, we were okay as far as that goes. There was one little relationship where, don't worry, we're okay. But they really, the Yeshiva University students were so, like, they were really kind of blown away with how well the Christian students knew the Bible. In a way that they're like, wow, I didn't know that, or whatever. But and we got along great. And it was kind of interesting that they had to go to Israel in order to really spend time and get to know these evangelical students. So there's a very large evangelical presence in Israel, where they are, they join every excavation basically in Israel. The Israel Antiquities Authorities requires an Israeli partner. So it's very rare to have a dig that doesn't include an Israeli institution. So it's always going to be people coming together. Now, much less so, say, getting people from like Arab, Arab country, like there's nobody from an Arab country who's coming to work there. But they do have, like there's a conference, the American Schools of, used to be Oriental Research, now that's, you're not allowed to say that, so it's Overseas Research, which, but anyway, there you'll have Israeli and Arab scholars will come to the US and we'll talk about kind of the things that they have found. In general, though, it's a little bit separate, meaning the Israelis are kind of working in Israel, they're working in, say, Jordan or in Iraq or whatever. So, but I think the Israelis are very interested to learn about the research that they're doing and kind of vice versa. So you do have a little bit of that. All right.
Are there any sites in the West?
Okay, so the question is about excavating in the West Bank. And basically, there is a lot of illegal excavation being done by Arabs in the West Bank, and mostly for the antiquities market, right? I mean, these are, it's unfortunately, there is a very vibrant illegal antiquities market, and people are, they're doing it because there's people willing to buy the stuff. As far as excavations, there is some debate in Israel itself about whether or not they should be excavating there or not. But there is definitely some excavations going on. Say a place like the ancient city of Jericho, which is, I think, technically in zone C or something. You can go visit it if you work through the army to go visit it or something. But otherwise, there's a little bit going on, and I will say there's probably going to be more. There used to not be any, and they just recently had a conference at Ariel University about whether or not, the ethics of it, and there is a very strong consensus, particularly among maybe more of the right, that they should be doing it. And I think there's also this feeling that we don't need to accommodate, like we don't need to worry about sensitivities anymore. Like, let's just go excavate. These are ancient Jewish sites. Why should we not be excavating them? Now, clearly, you're not going to go excavate in Hebron. You're not going to go excavate Shechem. But an isolated settlement where there's no people around, I have a feeling they're going to start doing more of that.
I understand that coins are the phrase, the gold standard of archaeology. That of all things that people would say when they were running out, one thing they would think that would be the money, whatever they could get. And yet you're finding, apparently archaeologists find coins like all the time, all over the place.
Right.
Why the coins?
So that's actually, so this is a question about coins, and why didn't the people take the coins with them when they were running away? So that's a good question. Couple things. One is, there are no coins in the First Temple period, right? So that's all going to be Persian period and afterwards. But secondly, a lot of times what happens is people bury them, they hide them, and they think they're going to come back and get them. Partly you don't want to run with all these coins on you because you don't want somebody to rob you. And so that's why we find a lot of these hoards is clearly the people intended to come back and get them. And for whatever, and I mean, sometimes they may have not be able to because they're no longer alive. And other times, if your city gets destroyed, your house is destroyed, sometimes you can't find them. You think you remembered where you hid them, but you don't know where they are. So I think mostly, though, they intended to come get them, and they didn't want to run with them because they were worried that they would get stolen as they were running.
I exercise chair's discretion and add, I'm going to do the thing where I say, I can have more of a comment than a question, but you can respond if you like. Jill made a lot of light of archaeology. Oh, it's no big deal. Anybody can do it. This is not true. Don't believe her for a second on that point. And maybe I should come closer, just to repeat that Jill made a lot of jokes about archaeology being easy. I think that we should take that with a grain of salt. But also, I think that when we talk about the purpose of research and we talk about the purpose of education, what we're seeing here is a prime example of the principle that we don't know where research is going to lead, right? These are archaeologists who thought that they were being trained to work in material at digs that excavating sites from 2,500 years ago. Unfortunately, they were called to use their research skills in a very different way after October 7th. But without them, we would be in a much worse place because we would have a lot less information about what happened on that day. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, research is open-ended for a reason, right? Would you like to comment on that, Dr. Katz?
So I guess, I mean, I think what you said, yeah, that's very, very true. And the other thing I will mention, though, just as far as from a pedagogical standpoint, is archaeology is one of those ways where we can bring students and actually have them do primary research, like they're doing original research. So they can, come in a summer. Many of them, they're always worried, what if I break something? And, the truth is, I tell them most of the stuff's already broken. But if you break something whole, yes, you're in big trouble. No, it's okay. The glue, we can put anything back together. But it is a way, and the students over the years, a few real things have stuck with me. One of which is, they're part of a large international team. I think we already mentioned that. And then they're also part of a team. One student once said to me, they'd never been with any group of people where people so readily volunteered. And I think the students also learn a really important message that is important both for research and for life, which is that, you're part of a project, you're part of a team. There's work to be done. Either you're going to do it or somebody else is going to do it. And you just need to decide. I mean, look, you can't do everything. Like, we don't expect the student, like, and also, like, if a student, it's hot, if they're tired, if they need to sit, that's okay. But there's no room for laziness. There's no room for idleness because you're part of a team. And if you're not helping out, then the other people are carrying a bigger burden. And I think that's also a really important lesson that the students take away, and are impressed that they're with this group of people who are so excited and enthusiastic about the work that they do. And yet, if somebody says, oh, we need somebody to go to the tool shed and it's hot as anything, and people volunteer, I'll go. And that by the end of the season, I see, these are kids, like they're like my kids, like they can be the laziest kids in the world. And yet by the end of the season, somebody says, who will go do X? Who's going to lift this? Who's going to carry this boulder? They raise their hand and go. So that's very gratifying, I will say.
Maybe one more question.
Slightly different. Has archaeological methodology been applied to the killing field of concentration camps in Europe?
So the question was about archaeological methodology to concentration camps or to the killing fields. Definitely to the concentration camps. I just don't know about the killing fields, but yeah. On the killing fields? Okay, so there's a good answer. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Do we have any examples of what a shekel was back?
so the question is about coinage and the shekel. So a shekel is it's probably more in the Torah when it's talking about shekalim, it's really referring to a weight, and to a weight of silver. And they have something known as what we call hack silver. And basically, if you were wealthy, you walked around with like a little coil of silver, and if you needed to purchase something with silver, you would just kind of saw off the appropriate weight of what you needed to do that.
What, for example?
Well, certainly you don't have any coins in Israel in the First Temple period. So people in those days, when you paid your taxes, it's funny because when you talk to students now and we're talking about coins, they don't even know what coins are. Like I'm saying to any of them, like, you guys know what a coin is? And they're like, I Zelle, I Venmo, they don't even use it anymore. So I feel like I'm an antiquity here. So in those days, you had to actually pay with the commodity. So, you were carrying like, bushels of wheat or barley or bringing your sheep and your goats. And so people were paying taxes very, very locally.